say about experts, that is a person that is most surprised by the latest evidence to the contrary. So, well, doggone it, it rained. Pretty disappointed in that. I know that those that are, have maybe trying to finish up corn are probably happy they got a little bit of rain to finish it up. But we missed the opportunity to show you all quite a few things I think that have been interesting on our farm concerning water use management. So we're going to improvise and hopefully maybe shed some more light on the subject. This aerial photo was taken on the 25th of August, and you can see in this area right here is our water use efficiency trials, and these were the trials that we're going to bring it to and show you. The pivot, of course, is right, we were irrigating right in the middle of the field, and I'll show you a little bit different infrared photograph in a minute that kind of shows how these water treatments work. You know, whenever I hear the results of any kind of research data, I'm always as interested in how the trial was conducted and what the parameters were and how the trial was executed as I am the actual data. It's really important that you establish some pretty good scientific practices when you do research in order to take the variability out of the study, and so you can be confident in the data that you get. Now, I remember when we first started doing this type of work back about 10 years ago, I was pretty surprised by some of the information we obtained. Matter of fact, I was actually pretty skeptical of my own data. I said, this just can't be true. And it took me several years of testing to convince myself that a lot of the things that we were seeing with water use efficiency were in fact true. There were some conventional wisdom and things that I believed before I started doing this work that I found was not true. And so it was pretty enlightening to me. And today I'm gonna try to show you some of these things that really kind of took me off the tracks when we started doing this study. But our plots are all 30 to 40 feet long, and they'll either be 2 or 4 rows. The way we do our seed is we count out the seed for every single row, and whether it's a big seeded variety or a small seeded variety, there 180 seed are put in these little coin packets, and that packet is used to plant that one row. For a 4-row plot, we would have 4 coin packets, and they're all put in order so we can sit on a little stool or chair on the back of the tractor, which would be actually in this location. The forward movement would be this way. And you can start the tractor running and go through the plots, dump your seed into this hopper, and it falls down into here and it starts to spin. This is a cone, and this cone spins and kind of distributes that seed evenly on the top of this cone. And then you hit a trip switch that's operated by a solenoid, and this little arm raises up and the seed falls down into this cone, and there's little compartments that hold the seed, and this cone turns 1 revolution every 40 feet. And so you just you dump seed, you go 40 feet, you dump seed, and you go 40 feet, and you can just keep planting. You don't ever have to stop your planter. And then you turn around and come back and do the same type of thing. So we use this cone planter to plant all plots. We plant 64,000 seed per acre, and I know for many of you that are here that are farmers, that sounds a little bit heavy, but a lot of times we get seed from South America that has kind of weak germ, and so we need to compensate that by planting a little heavier plant population. Also, anytime you have skippy plots, it really feeds into your variability and can cause problems with data stability. We irrigate on 4 irrigation regimes. We have a rain-fed regime that receives no water after flower. We have a 30% of potential evapotranspiration, 60% and a 90%. And for being able to relate, in general, your rain-fed would be about 8 inches a year, including your in-season rainfall. Your 30% PET would be about 10 to 12 inches, maybe 14 inches a year, just depending on how much you had to do early season. Your 60% PET would be around 16 to 18 inches, and then 90% would be above 22 inches. But the key to this is, when you start talking about how much water is PET, you really need to consider how much water it is from the time of flower to termination, or at the end of the season. And it's really not that much, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. Matter of fact, if you can count on your rainfall early, we're not talking about a whole lot of water mid-season to finish out the crop. And the late season water is the most important. This is a plot plan. We developed these plans on a spreadsheet. This happens to be Tim Culpepper's trial. What we want to do is we want to have, we have a 90% regime, and there are 16 rows that are planted in this 90%. This is a 60% regime, and there's 16 rows. Then there's 30% regime, there's 16 rows, and then the rain-fed is 16 rows. This tracks with a pivot. We have 8 drops here because we irrigate on LIPA, 8 drops here, 8 drops here, 8 drops here. This trial actually has 7 entries or 7 varieties in it, and so this would be considered the first replication in the 90%. You notice these same varieties are in the 60%, the same are in the 30, and the same are in the rain-fed. And then it took 2 ranges to get all your varieties in. These are alleyways in between. Then this would be the second replication. It has the varieties in here, except all jumbled up. Rep 1, Rep 2, and Rep 3 for the 90%. You can see that we like to jumble up and not make sure that we don't have the same variety, behind itself in any one spot. We want to try to make one irrigation nozzle, not necessarily irrigate all the varieties in one treatment. So you can see that we have, for example, Fibermax 1900 was irrigated by these 2 drops, and then down here in the second replication it was irrigated by another set of drops, and then back over here by another set of drops. So that takes the variability out. This happened to be a 3-rep trial. Sometimes we'll do 4 reps or 6-rep trials. But anyway, this just kind of show you how the trial is laid out. Then we take our pivot and we modify the pivot, and we put extra drops in the 90% PET and the 30% PET. This is a picture of the 90%. You can see the blue hoses would be the 90% drop, and what we actually do is we select a flow rate, a nozzle for that position that would have an increased flow rate of 50% over 60% PET. So if 60% is flow rate is 0.5, we would select a nozzle that would have a flow rate of 0.75. And so anyway, we can turn this one off and this one on, and we can turn this one off and turn this one on. And the same thing goes with the 30% PET. We'll select a nozzle, we'll have a set of drops, we'll select a nozzle that will put off half of what the 60 would put out. And so when we run this pivot through the field to irrigate, we have, this would be the normal drop. This would be the one that if we were just irrigating the crop normally, would be putting out at 60% of PET. But for these 16 rows, 2, 3, 4, we're going to turn these black hoses off and turn the blue ones on, and that's going to make those 4 drops put out more water, or 90% of PET. And then the same thing would happen with the 30%, except we would turn the 60% off, turn the blue hoses on, which would have nozzles that were putting on half of what you would put on at 60%. And then in the rain-fed plots, we just have cutoffs on the hoses, and we just cut them off, just turn them completely off. We irrigate only by LIPA when we're doing our PET irrigations. If you had never heard me before, you'll know that I will just stand on my head and preach about not irrigating by broadcast spray. If you're a farmer in this room and you're irrigating by broadcast spray, you need to very seriously consider changing to a LIPA system. The efficiency and difference in this is so phenomenal and so different that it is not even debatable. And so I would urge anybody that's still on broadcast spray, you're really hurting yourself by staying on that system. I'm going to show you some yield data in a minute that really points that out. We will irrigate occasionally on broadcast spray for the incorporation of pre-emerged herbicides, but all those pre-emerges are put on way prior to bloom before we start our PET irrigation. So there is you still can irrigate broadcast spray with a LIPA system, but and there is a place for broadcast spray, but not a very big place. And so I'll dwell on that here in a minute. When you think about conventional wisdom, Mark Twain said it best: it ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And I know I was exactly in that boat when I first started doing drought tolerant work. A lot of things that I thought were true weren't necessarily true, and so I want to introduce you to some of that today. If we would have been at the trial site today, you would have seen this. This picture was taken just a day or two ago. We always have a concept, or I did, always thought more water means bigger cotton. It's always, you put a lot of water on it, you got to manage it more with picks, and you're going to get growthy cotton. If you would have been out in the plot today, you would have seen that this row divides two varieties. You can see the height of this variety. This is a 90% irrigated regime. That cotton is up here. This is a variety also irrigated 90, and there's about 10 to 12 inches difference. So, growth response isn't always an indication of, how well something can perform and whether it's been in a high irrigation regime or not. This variety is pretty well cut out. This one is still going, and to irrigate something like that in a 90% PET irrigation regime really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If you've had the thing, terminated and cut off, and all you're doing is retaining the last few bowls, 90% irrigation isn't going to help you a whole lot in a variety like this. It could in this, so it would point out the need for selecting varieties that definitely could respond at the higher levels. And it's important to select varieties that respond also at the lower levels. And I want to go more into that in a minute. If you take these same two varieties and look at it in a 60% irrigation regime, you can still see a little bit of height difference, but not quite as much. As you take water away from cotton, it's always interesting to note, especially when you get down to those lower regimes, the rain-fed regime, a lot of things start getting real close together. Your yield gets close together. Your response to water is taken away from the cotton, and so when you get in a totally rain-fed or no water situation, a lot of these varieties don't express themselves as much as they would maybe as you start adding water. One thing that I learned is it doesn't take very much water to make a pretty big difference in yield, and as you apply water, it's just like as you increase the blooming cycle and you go into a more fruit load, it takes more water. Well, it's really important not to just put any amount of more water on it. It's important to kind of track that water up at a given percentage of what the potential evapotranspiration rate would be. And I'm not going to go into it today, but TAWC has a website that will give you the information you need to determine how much water your cotton needs on a day-to-day basis. It's called the TAWC website. It's www.tawcsolutions.org. You can log on to that website, create your username and password, enter your location. Texas Tech has zillions of mesonet sites, a huge benefit to growers in the West Texas area and South Texas area. And you can assign a mesonet site to your farm, and you can get your local weather data to determine your PET numbers. So excellent website. It's the one we use to make determinations on when we're going to irrigate on our farm. Okay, this infrared photo was taken on the 25th of August, and this has been an area you would have visited. These little red lines are the alleyways. These are the plots, they're 40 foot, and these are the water use plots going around this way. You can see we started irrigating, and we got about halfway through when this photo was taken. The pivot is moving in this direction toward the south. You can see that these 16 rows here would be the 90% PET. These 16 rows here would be the 60%. These 16 rows would be the 30%, and these 16 would be the rain-fed. What's interesting to me is we actually had all these nozzles cut off on the rain-fed and 30% PET when we irrigated. The rain kind of messed up our trial this year. We got more rain than we wanted. When you're doing water use efficiency work, you don't want it to rain. And we got an inch and a third rain that kind of fell at a time that threw off our 30%. So we had to do some engineering and change drops around and cut off valves on pivots. And we decided on this irrigation we weren't going to irrigate the 30% or 60% treatment. And you can see that it's yellow behind, and it's yellow and red, and it's red in front. The 60 and 90 still is green, which means it's lush, and it's still green in front. So we were supplying water, pretty much ahead of the demand of the crop at 60 to 90% of PET. Okay, conventional wisdom. Does more water always mean more yield? Will the highest yielding variety in the 90% PET irrigation regime be the highest yielding one in the 60, the 30, or the rain-fed? What does how and when you apply water really matter? And so these are some of the things I'm going to try to address in some yield response data that I'm going to show you in the next few slides. Now, it doesn't matter what these varieties are. This is 2013 data. A lot of them have been, actually some of these varieties were never even selected. They were just discarded. They were experimentals. Some of them were not advanced. Some of them were named, and I don't even know the name of them. And some of them are probably currently on the market. So it's not important what these varieties are. I'm not trying to come here and convince you that one variety is necessarily better than another. I want to talk to you about the concept. And this is the same concept we see every year in our drought tolerance trials, which has made me such a strong believer in the fact that we're really missing something when we start looking at yield response data and selecting our varieties for planting on our farms. The green highlighted areas are the highest yielders in each one of the regimes. This would be the 90%, this is 60, 30, and rain-fed. And you can see that the experimental 15 was the highest yielder in the 90%. Experimental 24 was the highest yielder in the 60. Experimental 42 was the highest yielder in the 30. And the rain-fed regime was this one down here, experimental 12. Keep in mind, rain-fed isn't really rain-fed totally. It just did not get water after flower. But keep in mind, we have to conduct these trials this way because those rain-fed regimes would be so variable from year to year that the data would be totally useless. And so we kind of have to keep them alive and keep them growing up until right before flower, and then we cut the water off of them, and they just survive on rainfall. Well, I think you noticed right away that even though this was the highest yielder in the 90% of the high irrigation regime, it wasn't the highest yielder all the way across. Matter of fact, none of these really captured the high yield all the way across a given spectrum. When you look at variety demonstration data, or when you start to evaluate it as a farmer, and you say, okay, I'm going to look at these variety yields, and I'm going to decide which variety am I going to plant next year. How many of you really ever asked, well, how much was that water? It just makes a pretty big difference, because if you happen to be farming around, east of Plainview, you might be able to irrigate at 60% of PET. And if you're farming at Olton, you're probably irrigating at 30% of PET. Well, you can't irrigate at 90% of PET, no matter how much you would love to be able to do it. You just don't have the water to irrigate at that level. So why are you looking at selecting a variety that yielded in a 90% PET trial? Also, you'll notice in here that this variety went from 1,652 pounds to 1,431 pounds when it went to 90% PET. You say, how can that be? Well, that happens quite often. This variety was really, really growthy with that extra water. We just made a big old plant with a bunch of knots. It never matured out. And we took a yield drag on it. And it's one reason why that, I don't believe ever in irrigating at 90% of PET. In this area, the best we can do is 60 to 70% of PET and maintain consistency of performance in the varieties that we grow. And they say, well, I want to make 5 bales per acre. Okay, well then you need to plant April 1st or mid-April and get it up. And then you need to put a lot of water on it. And about half of the years that you're going to do that, you're going to make a bunch of knots and you're going to make 2 bales. The other half, you might make 4 or 5 bales. But when you average those years, 4 or 5 bales, it's pretty unachievable. People that say they're making 4 or 5 bales may be doing it, but they're not doing it every year. And so I like to look at averages. With a 30% ET regime, you can see you can make anywhere between 900 and 1,100 pounds. You get up to 60%, you're in that 3 bale range, 2.5 to 3 bale per acre. You get into 90%, and of course this year was a year that we were able to, knock the top out, maybe make some higher yield. Okay, loan values, I guess, are the thing that we need to look at closest. In this particular case, we had our highest yield responder didn't necessarily carry over and provide the highest yield response in the 60 or the 30 or the rain-fed. But in this case, when you looked at loan values, the experimental 49 carried over very well. From 60 to 90, it was the highest. It was the highest dollar per acre loan value, and then we get into about $665 an acre loan value on the 30, and then this one in the rain-fed was 482. And so, not a big point here, other than we do need to look at the loan value rather than just the yields. So when you select your varieties, I know most people look at yield data. I suggest that you consider looking at data that is reflective of your ability to irrigate. If you're like 8 to 10 inch a year grower, you're kind of in the 30% PET range. If you're 12 to 16 inches, you're 60% PET, and you need to look at your real yield responses from that aspect. If I was a farmer, I have one farmer that I work for that farms from Olton all the way north to Edmondson, and he generally goes from a total rain-fed situation where he just puts on very little extra water, and then he gets up north of Edmondson where he can irrigate at 60 to 70% of PET. If I was in that particular situation, I'd be planting about 5 or 6, maybe 7 different varieties. Okay. And those varieties would be selected based on my irrigation capacity. And so you say, what is your, you need to select based on your capacity to irrigate. We also consider lint percentages. So let me ask you, so you say, okay, we're going to do a little exercise here. We're going to look at these loan values and say, how would you select a variety out of this list if you were, let's say, a rain-fed farmer, okay? Well, obviously, you're going to want to select the variety that can provide you the greatest return in the regime that you farm in that you have. And so these in the brownish red or the orange color would be the highest returners. So I would plant EXP15, EXP12, and conventional. But I didn't just use the data off of the rain-fed response to make that decision. I said, you know, if I just get a little bit of rain, I can go from a rain-fed regime to a 30% with just about 3 more inches of water. 2.5 to 3 more inches of water. It doesn't take as much water as you think when you get, and I mean 2.5 to 3 inches at the initiation of flower, okay? Your soil will store about 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches per foot. If you get a good rain, you know, that rain can carry you over, and you could easily get to, you know, 2 inches, 2.5 inches. It could bump you from a rain-fed to a 30. And so you say, okay, well, this one is, you know, pretty good here. It's $450, but look at, you know, value, but look at what it is at 30%. It's $551. These would go, this one would go to $575, this one would go $583, $579. So really, you're considering both of them. And the same thing when it comes to the 30% of PET, you would want to select varieties that do well in that regime, but also have the potential to respond well in the next higher irrigation regime. A lot of time in corn, we use the word, you know, term flex. You know, the ear has the ability to increase the number of kernels and the number of rows to compensate for row spacing or weather. And so these varieties, you want to check, select one. I would select these in the green. You notice as you add water, you know, you start to have a bigger response in the number of varieties. So a lot of them really responded well kind of in this 30% regime. But as you go to 60%, we only recommended 2. I would select this one because it would do well here as well as here. And then in the 60%, I would select this blue one because it would do well in the 60, and it was one of the higher yielding at the 90. And so whenever I selected, you know, any varieties in each regime, I'm always looking at the next higher one up. This one to this one, this one to this one. Then when you get to the 90% PET, you're not going to back down, you're going to be growing at 90%, and so you're just selecting the highest yielding variety. So if you're growing at the higher regime, you know, you're just basically selecting the highest yielding variety. So, my general recommendations is if you are not using LIPA, that you need to change your pivots. And I'll be happy to talk to anybody that's farming with broadcast spray pivots, and I'll explain the differences to you. But let me tell you, they're very significant. Let's say, for example, you're going to irrigate and put 12 inches on during a year at about 50% efficiency with a broadcast spray pivot. That's going to be 6 inches, okay? You really only get 6 inches to the crop. The rest of it's evaporating off. If you use a LIPA system and your efficiency goes to 80% and you're putting out that 12 inches, that's 9.6 inches. That's 3.6 inches more water for your crop than in the broadcast spray. That just took you from rain-fed to 30, or it took you from 30 to 60. You can gain about 80 to 100 units, 70 units per inch of water. So if you're growing cotton and you get that, and that we're talking about that inch of water in flower, and you gain 3 inches of water and 80 pounds, you've gained 240 pounds. You can pay for the conversion in 1 year. You need to go to a LIPA system. I also recommend that you irrigate based on a given percentage of PET, whatever your capacity to irrigate is. If you can't irrigate at 90%, cotton does not respond well if you just put a lot of water on it, then go over there and water the corn and stress it out. Put a lot of water on it, then go over there to the sorghum and stress it out. It's just not a good practice. It's just, you just need to put on a certain percentage of potential evapotranspiration. So let's say this week your potential evapotranspiration calls for 1.25 inches, and you can only put on 60%. That would be about an inch, 9,200. will consistently put on 60%. If you learn to irrigate that way and follow those curves down, your yield becomes much more consistent. You get more value for your inch of water in terms of yield response. It works every time. This is one of the things that was a common misconception for me. I never realized how important timely calculated amounts of water were to yield and how well they related. Always irrigated a consistent percentage of potential evapotranspiration, and select varieties that have the potential to perform at your capacity to irrigate. There's a lot of interest in drought tolerance. We use drought, I use that word, actually it's water use efficiency, by all the seed companies that are here today. And they're starting to develop this information, and really the best place to get a lot of this information is from them. They use the same stringent requirements for testing, and in my opinion do a real good job of relating to what their variety's potential really is, and they're not going to want to sell you something that does not perform. Now they're going to want to sell you something, but they're not going to want to sell you something that doesn't do a good job. And so I trust the data that I get from companies as it relates to drought tolerance information and water use efficiency. Start looking at that, considering it maybe a little bit more as you begin to select varieties for next year. And that